Shivshankar Menon, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you for having me.
Is political assassination part of India's statecraft?
No. Our agencies weren't set up for this, so I'd be amazed if these allegations were true. And I noticed that governments have been careful in the words they use. Prime Minister Trudeau said credible allegations and of potential linkages.
I mean, it stands to reason that a Prime Minister wouldn't put his reputation on the line without some serious evidence, however.
I assume so, and we've made it clear that we'd be happy to look at it and do what we can.
Now, you made the point that the Indian Security Agency wasn't set up to do this, but of course it was set up a long time ago after the war with, I think, the war with border dispute with Pakistan.
Yes. First China, then Pakistan.
Yes. So the fact that it was set up for those purposes years ago doesn't really determine its present state. At the same time, the US Secretary of State was also, while not verifying the claims, encouraged India to cooperate.
I think nobody's actually commented on the claims themselves. What they've said is, let's get to the bottom of it and let's cooperate in investigation. But the agencies, I mean, I've known the agencies until fairly recently, until I retired in 2014. So really, I find it incredible, I mean, to believe this.
Let's assume that Prime Minister Trudeau is operating on good evidence. Isn't it the case that the
That's
Indian...
a big assumption.
Let's work on that assumption for the moment, again based on the fact that he made that claim in Parliament. You were the National Security Advisor in the Indian government. You know that the Indian Security Agency doesn't have to seek the approval of that person to carry out an operation overseas, as I understand it. So what do we actually know about...
I'm not sure who told you that. I mean,
is that incorrect?
They need approvals.
From whom?
And there is a system, an internal system, of checks and balances to make sure that what they do is correct. So I'm not sure where that idea came from.
Well, I apologise if that's incorrect, but let me ask you this then. Would an operation of such a nature, that is the targeted assassination of a citizen in a foreign country, require the approval of the Prime Minister of India?
It wouldn't even come up because, as I said, they're not set up for this sort of thing. So I'm not sure that, I think that's a huge assumption you're making. That's not true.
But you've gone back to the idea of what the agency was set up for, but it's many years ago, right?
For me, it's inconceivable. I mean, it's to assume that they do something that they're not equipped to do.
Is it the case, though, that the Indian security services, they're not subject to parliamentary oversight? Isn't that correct?
There is a system, but it's an internal system. It's not. It's an executive system, and it's a system within the executive part of government. It's true that they're not subject to legislative oversight right now.
So
There's been talk, by the way, of having some sort of legislative oversight, and it's never actually fructified yet. But
so even the CIA has oversight by Congress. So if there is no oversight from the parliamentary system in India, how do we know what the Indian security agencies are doing overseas, including in Australia?
Let me turn that question around. Why do you doubt them when there isn't evidence available to us?
I guess what we're relying on at the moment is the fact that a Prime Minister of a democratic country has used the Parliament of that country to make a very serious allegation that is clearly being taken seriously by the US Secretary of State, just for example.
I think what's happening is there's been a series of leaks in the media across the world. It's a fantastic story. It's a big story. Because it is so inconceivable.
A tragic story.
If it were true that we were involved, it would be a tragic story, but the death itself is a tragic death. And there are multiple explanations possible. I'd be very careful before I jump to conclusions, start blaming governments or individuals or whatever. And I don't want to question the motives of why Prime Minister Trudeau might have said it, why other people have not endorsed the claims, but have said take it seriously and look into it. And we've said we'll look into it. So I'd be a little careful in how I frame this.
Let me ask you this. Is it possible that India's security services, the RAW, are monitoring Australian citizens in Australia?
I think to the extent that there are there's open source information in the newspapers everywhere about what happens in the diaspora, and there's a natural interest in India in what's happening in the diaspora, yes, they would be knowing what's happening.
Are you suggesting
but to call it monitoring
yes, that's the question.
Is a different thing. This is part of their normal remit. it's their job to look at the environment in which we operate, in which we try and further India's interests. And this is part of that. The diaspora always has been very important.
Do Sikh activists in Australia, like those people featured in our programme, pose a threat to India?
Not that I know of. But then, you know, I've been out of the loop for a long time, since 2014, as I said. I know as much as maybe you do, maybe less.
Is it possible that the targeting of members of the diaspora has increased since you left your position in the government?
I don't know of such instances.
Clearly those people feel that there is some risk to them. Is it possible they are justified in those feelings?
I have no idea. I have no basis on which to support or actually even to deny what they're saying. I mean, that's their opinion.
So just to be absolutely clear, you'd rule out the possibility that the Indian Security Service would be doing more than open source monitoring inside Australia?
I think that's the normal business of...
And no more?
No, I wouldn't see them as doing very much more. They don't have to, frankly, because in most of these cases, they're political activists who want the publicity. So they're actually putting themselves out there in the public space to get their message out.
Now, I want to talk about the speech that you gave today and what you've been saying about the international order, clearly in light of the terrible events over the weekend. You said that the international order is already fraying. What is the potential for the situation in the Middle East to further destabilise a fraying world?
I think it's clearly after these attacks and the scale of these attacks and the surprise that they caused, not just in Israel but across the world, I think it's clear that they will have major consequences, not just on Israeli politics but on the entire political direction of travel in the Middle East. You know, the US has been trying to broker some form of peace between Saudi Arabia and Israel. There has been movement even between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I think many of these things, we've seen the Abraham Accords, we've seen a whole series of events, and I think much of that will come to a stop for a while. How long that lasts, I think it's very hard to tell right now.
I also want to talk about just India and Australia. As Australia proceeds with the AUKUS programme, as they are building nuclear-powered submarines, does India see itself having a role in the technological part of that programme as it develops?
I think, you know, we have very common interests in the maritime security across the Indo-Pacific. And I'm sure we'd be very happy to work with Australia on that. Our navies already cooperate. And there is a great deal that we are doing, increasingly more and more. Not just maritime domain awareness, but also in other respects. So I'm sure we'd be happy to. Not just in technology, but in various other ways.
You describe China as becoming, it's an interesting description, you describe China as becoming hard, brittle and touchy. You also said that the balance of terror operating in Asia today is important. Is that your view, that we need mutual fear to keep the region free from conflict?
It's just that it is a very heavily nuclearized region. So when I said terror, I didn't mean terrorism.
No, of course not.
What I meant was the presence of weapons of mass destruction across the continent, all the way from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. And I think the fear of those consequences, I think, has kept the peace. India and Pakistan have not fought an open war since they both became overt nuclear weapon states. They fought us in Kargil, they did fight, but it was very limited. And they consciously kept it limited. So in that sense, there is, I mean, it's not a happy thought that deterrence operates on fear, but there is a certain amount of deterrence that those weapons have provided. My fear is that that might be breaking down today.
Clearly, that's something we will have more time to talk about. Shivshankar Menon, in the meantime, I thank you very much indeed for coming in to talk to us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.